About 2 weeks ago, we had the debate, right, between Trump and Kamala Harris. And I had thought at the time I was going to go in a different direction about preaching, but I'm telling you that that debate got me kind of distracted and attracted to some meta themes, themes worth talking about, I think. Now, I'm going to be upfront here. I am partisan. I'm kind of left of liberal, and I'm sure that will leak into my preaching this morning. But my goal is not to speak from my bias, but to try to understand what this upcoming election says about America. Or to put it in another way, I'm really been trying to figure out how might the election and the election campaigns be a window into where we are at in our American story and what exactly actually that story is. I'm hoping today to invite you into that exploration with me as well. Now, here's one of my starting points. If you meet with a therapist or with even like come to a minister for pastoral care, they have a different way of engaging with you around your life than someone like a spiritual director. If I go to a spiritual director with my experiences, they often will posit to you the question of how is this experience kind of trying, how is God trying to speak a word of comfort or challenge to you? Now, God may not work for you. Maybe spirit does, maybe life does, maybe think your inner voice or inner wisdom. No matter what it is, my hope is to approach this with the question of where is the larger spiritual comfort and challenge showing up in this election season? So I actually think there are three areas that are shimmering for me. In other words, I think there are three areas that are most richly serve as a window, actually, kind of into what we need to learn as people trying to make America not great again, but simply good and decent again. So let me start first with abortion. So that debate was telling. I'm not sure I can remember a debate where abortion was mentioned as many times as it was in that one, which isn't really that surprising given the fall of Roe, right? Constitutional amendments on abortion are on the ballot in 10 different states this November, obviously, including in Florida. Harris did a brilliant job of arguing the great costs to all of us of rescinding federal legislation regarding abortion. And as psyched as I am, because I'm really pretty psyched actually, that the conversation is, come to the place of talking about women's reproductive rights and freedom, even just for God's sakes, talking about like women's health. The country seems to be in the same place it was during the midterm elections 2 years ago. So I want you to think back 2 years ago, there were claims that while polls were saying that abortion is important, the election could very well just come down to the economy and inflation as the core worries that everybody was going to vote on. Pundits everywhere lifted up the perils of not focusing on the rising gas costs and food costs and material costs that were skyrocketing and forcing people to let go of their supposedly like higher Maslow needs and get back to the basics with their voting, to the fundamentals of the current economic realities. That old phrase, came back, I think, to everybody's mind. It's about the economy, stupid. And then, if you'll remember, the election came right, and lo and behold, abortion was the issue for many. 2 years ago, there were constitutional amendments on the ballot to legalize abortion in four different states: Vermont, Michigan, California, and Montana. And then in Kentucky, there was one to ban abortion completely. Now, those four states that wanted to constitutionalize the right to abortion, all four of them it passed and it got into the constitution of those states. And the one that in a very red state was trying to ban abortion completely, it did not pass. Now, exit polls that were conducted by networks and the Edison Research Group showed that in Pennsylvania, abortion overtook the economy as the top issue on voters' minds. And in Michigan, nearly half of all voters said abortion was their top issue. Now, when that came out, it felt like an astounding kind of turn of events. And it got me thinking about why is that actually? And here's the thing that I think, frankly, was missed by a lot of commentators and pundits. If you look at who is getting an abortion in America right now, the typical patient, if you will, is in her first 6 weeks of pregnancy and is having her first abortion. But there's more to her than just that, okay? She is already a mother. She's in her late 20s. She's attended some college, has loans from that college, has a low income, and is married and sometimes married or unmarried. In other words, she's already a financially stressed person. Now, I want you to think about that a little bit, and a different story starts to emerge, and that is for women. For those who are seeking an abortion, abortion is an economic issue. It's not just an issue of personal autonomy, it is an issue of the pocketbook. And in the end, it will be the determining and determinate factor in her lifetime economic trajectory. And to miss that is to miss the underlying reality of so many women and the very real like circumstances that can make and break a family's well-being, security, and stability. When you don't have any money to raise another kid, right? It does come down to basic economics. Again, if you're talking about somebody on a low income, let's take something like somebody making, I don't know, $12 an hour, right? That roughly comes to about $25,000 a year. Now, here's the thing. The Brookings Institute recently came out with figures about how much it costs to raise a kid in a year. And what they came to was to say that it costs $17,000. Now, you wouldn't think that doesn't sound like that much money, but if you're only making $25,000, there's not a lot left over, right? You add another kid to that, and now you're at $34,000. Now, I'm not great at math, but it seems to me that there's a $9,000 deficit between making 25,000 and the cost of having two children at 34, because children are expensive. Ironically, the issue for most women seeking an abortion is about taking care of the children they already have. So they indeed can be the best parents they can be. And that, it seems to me, is like a really value-laden, very moral, fundamental truth. So I want to go back to that spiritual question, director question of what is the word of comfort or challenge here? And I think the challenge is to go back and relearn that 1960s slogan and what it was trying to teach us, that the personal is political and the political is personal. Or to put it another way, we've got to widen kind of our entire eyes to the whole person and the way that their concerns and worries and struggles can't be like neatly dissected and singled out from one another. There's also an additional challenge here, I think. And I think this is a big one. We need to be brave and call a spade a spade. When abortion folks, anti-abortion folks, when anti-abortion folks try to act as if they own caring and empathy, especially in this election cycle, and abortion rights is posited as a do whatever I want kind of selfishness, we need to name that as small-sighted at best and hypocritical at worst. Forcing impoverishment on families and overstressing parents is not caring for them nor for their children. Plain and simple, compassion comes with contextualizing women and their families into the greater economic realities of their lives. With so many abortion measures on the ballot this cycle, more than double that they were in the midterms, it still in the end comes down to it's about the economy, stupid. Just a wider sense of what counts as the economic issue. Okay. Second area trying to speak to us and offer a word of comfort or challenge is this. David Brooks, the opinion writer for the New York Times, highlights how every decade, right, there is a change in values and fashion and norms. And he claims, I think a lot of people would agree, that it is those values, not policy and positions, that are the determinant factor that decides who wins elections. And so the question that should be asked is, if we want to understand which politician has the advantage, what are the dominant values and moods in America right now? So 1970s and all through the 80s was considered the decade of narcissism, or as Tom Wolfe called it, the me decade. It was an era of kind of unchained self-esteem, self-expression, and self-promotion. And then came the 1990s, which was kind of the death of history, if you will. The Cold War ended, and it was the end of apartheid. Then the early 2000s brought with it the war on terror. 2010s came along, and it ushered in what's been coined the age of indignation. So here's what he says. Groups on the right, which were the mostly rural working class, and on the left, BLM folks, had been marginalized by the establishment demanding new power and representation. And disgust with established power was very high. Social trust had completely dropped. And then in walks Donald Trump, a millionaire whose disgust and scorn for the Manhattan elite, as Brooke points out, is built up over a lifetime of anti-establishment resentment that dovetailed actually perfectly with the working class's pervasive contempt. Then you got 2018 that came into all of this. And there's a group called More in Common, and it released a survey of the American electorate in which it popularized the phrase, the exhausted majority. It basically showed how people were tired of like the bitterness and the snarliness. I'm not really sure that's a word, but I like it. Snarliness. And the constant psychodrama. Then 2020 came around with a desire to leave that kind of snarl behind, and yet it's hung on with this battle between the forces of indignation over here and then the forces of exhaustion over here. So watching the debate on Tuesday, I sat in the back of a room because I honestly, I couldn't even like sit on a couch near the television, and my stomach was in knots because I'm kind of a member of the exhausted majority, and I'm not sure how to handle another 4 years of indignation and snarliness. And at the end of that debate, I was acting actually like my favorite football team had just won the Super Bowl, which is the Green Bay Packers, by the way. Anyway, that's regardless. Now, you could argue, which I believe is true, that my favorite candidate, she who must not be named, schlocked the other guy, which made me giddy, which I think there's something to be said about all of that, but I also think that there's something else in here that I need to pay attention to, and perhaps you do too. Brooks is arguing that joy is back, actually, if we would just let it be so. Let's not let our desire to go after our opponents overshadow the opportunity to put our energy behind that joy that is starting to take root. Or another way of really saying that is to go to that Nietzsche kind of quote, which, you know, you may or may not remember, and I'm not going to say it the way he did because it's so 19th century, but he basically was saying, be careful how you fight the monster, because if you're not aware, you become the monster as well. And it seems to me that joy can't afford to have us distracted. It needs our energy and it needs us to embody it if it's going to truly bloom. Okay, so the third area, which is kind of related to the second area, uh, but it's got its own kind of comfort and challenge to it. And it's this. So the United States, first and foremost, is based on an idea, an idea. There's a line from a poem that I have carried around with me for a long, long time, and I love pulling it out every now and then. And it's this. Let me make an oath. Let me make an oath to fight for the soul of America, the land that never has been and yet must be. I love that line because I actually think it gets to the challenge that we have before us. This American project is it's holy work. To commit to the ideals of this country means we are like constantly fighting for the soul of who we say we are and acting to make sure we live up to it. America is an ongoing, evolving, living, breathing organism. It isn't a theory or something that's a given or something that just happens on its own. It takes work to make sure that we remain committed and connected to each other. To the least of these amongst us, to the suffering, to the disenfranchised, to the neglected and the abused. Committed to justice and equity and compassion, no matter one's race or ethnicity or creed or gender or sexual orientation or wealth or lack thereof. So, given that we are such a divided country, that we sometimes have different versions of the point of America or what its ideals are, I think it's important to lift up a few things. So often in this country, the individual's rights are kind of taunted as the definition of what it means to be patriotic, lifted up above and beyond the collective. So much so that I honestly forget that the individual is subservient in the end to the greater whole. This collective centered version of the United States is embedded in all of the documents that we actually hold dear, right? By, for, and of the people, not only is in what they have always called the People's Constitution, but was also in the Gettysburg Address. E pluribus unum, which means out of many is one, is on all of our currency. Now, here's where I've got to make a confession. There are times during the last number of years, and maybe most importantly now, when my fear, like for the future, about a second Trump presidency rears its ugly head, and I get a little shaky about whether or not I feel like I even belong here anymore. Because I'm not someone who's ever flown the flag outside of my house. I'm not someone who's ever said USA, USA, USA. And honestly, I don't even really understand the whole God bless America thing. I have been a Unitarian Universalist way too long to not have it drilled into my head the importance of understanding yourself as part of a world community. In other words, it's this little tiny planet that we are all on, no matter one's country, that we should be paying attention to. And frankly, that's a more enticing idea to me than nationalism. And this becomes especially true when individualism is taunted as the point of the American experience and commitment. So when I get angsty, I shouldn't really admit this, but I often think about swimming over the St. Lawrence River and showing up in Canada and wondering if they'll even notice that I'm there or not. But watching the debates, thinking through that idea of like a large tent America, one which reminds us that for the most part, we're all immigrants, one that wants to lift all boats, one that says we are all in this together. I get a little ashamed of my fantasy of running away from my home country. This week, I've had to really think about all of this. Feel like I've grown up a little spiritually, had a bit of a challenge come my way, and faced a hard truth. Anything worth having or believing in is worth working for and fighting for. I'm going to say it again. Anything worth having or believing in is worth working for and fighting. So I had to embrace the possibility that, well, when I give up on what America could be, I'm actually giving up on something far greater than my own individual freedoms and rights. I'm giving up on all of us, on we, the people. To walk away is not just to give up on certain ideas and hopes, it's to give up on real people. So last week I was reminded of something else as well, and I had like this little epiphany. In 1892, a socialist Christian minister named Francis Bellamy, he actually wrote the original Pledge of Allegiance. Now, Bellamy believed very strongly in the separation of church and state, and he did not put in there under God into the pledge. That was added, by the way, in the 1950s as anti-communist. So Bellamy's pledge, though, went like this. I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So here's my little epiphany. It may seem small, but for some reason, I'm telling you, this like really hit me hard. We say the pledge today as I pledge allegiance to the flag, right? I pledge allegiance to the flag. That is not how Bellamy wrote it. He wrote it as I pledge allegiance to my flag. And right there, man, I tell you, that was the sun, the moon, and the stars. I pledge allegiance to my flag. My flag. Do you know how many times I have acquiesced the symbolism of the flag to the religious and conservative right, to gun-toting, nationalistic, militaristic, xenophobic claiming Americans? The pledge and the flag I tend not to own. I like holding on to words actually like e pluribus unum and we the people instead of the flag. So in the past, the flag has made me feel like I need to submit to the flag. But my flag seems to assume a caretaker role in which the flag and what it stands for is asking for my help, not demanding my allegiance. It's more like the relationship I have with those I hold dear. For instance, my husband, I make a vow to, I commit to him, I promise him something. My children, I hold in a certain reverence, awe, and I carry a fierce. My friends are bestowed a certain place in my heart and affection for their well-being. My family is a place that I know that they love me, whether I earned it or not. My community is one in which I choose to dedicate my commitment and energy towards the inclusion of all of its members. And my church is where I give of my time, my talent, and my treasure. My flag gives me ownership of it, a caretaker role to the big tent ideals and aspirations that I know are foundational to our country. So when I look at the flag and I say, I pledge allegiance to my flag. I have in my head a different kind of oath, one that is dedicated to fight for the soul of America. So I want to take a deep breath and sum this all up. The personal is political and the political is personal. Plain and simple, compassion comes with contextualizing women and their families into the greater economic realities of their lives. Let us remember that when we fight monsters, to be careful of how we do it so that we don't become monsters ourselves. So let us tend to let joy in instead and help it to bloom. And finally, let us make an oath to fight for the soul of America, the land that never has been yet and yet must be. May that be our holy work, my friends, and may that be our calling. May it be so.